Nimitz estimated that the Japanese would make a full-scale attack for the quick occupation of Midway, that submarines would scout and intercept our forces up to 200 miles west of Oahu, that the carrier planes and battleships would attempt to get at our surface forces, and that the sinking of our carriers would be a prime objective. Admiral Nimitz's orders to his two commanders of carrier task forces, Fletcher and Spruance, were to inflict maximum damage on enemy by employing strong attrition tactics, which in the naval language of that day meant airstrikes on enemy ships. He cannily ordered Fletcher and Spruance to take initial positions to the northeastward of Midway, beyond search range of the approaching enemy, anticipating that the 700-mile searches by Midway-based planes would locate the Japanese carriers before the presence of his own would be divulged. To this he added a special letter of instruction. In carrying out the task assigned, you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you shall interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage on the enemy. No commander-in-chief's instructions were ever more faithfully and intelligently carried out than these, by Admirals Fletcher and Spruance. Admiral Fletcher, as senior to Admiral Spruance, became OTC, Officer in Tactical Command, as soon as their rendezvous was effected. As he possessed no aviation staff and Spruance had Halsey's, it was probably fortunate that Spruance exercised practically an independent command during the crucial actions of 4, the 6th of June. Neither he nor Fletcher exercised any control over the air and ground forces on Midway Island, over the submarines deployed in their area, or over Admiral Theobald's force in the Aleutians. The overall commander was Admiral Nimitz, who remained perforce at his Pearl Harbor headquarters. Patrol craft of the Sea Frontier Forces were stationed as aircraft rescue ships at Lisiansky, Laysan, Gardner Pinnacles, and Necker Island, the islets on the Kauai-Midway line. Seaplane tenders Thornton and Ballard were stationed at French frigate Shoals. All available Army bombers at Oahu were alerted to reinforce Midway if needed, and both Army and Navy Air Forces conducted searches 800 miles out from Oahu in the northwest sector. Midway itself, the tiny objective of these mastodonic forces, had plenty of attention during the month preceding the battle. Early in May, Admiral Nimitz flew up to make a personal inspection of the atoll. He found the defense organization working perfectly under close cooperation between Commander Cyril T. Simard, the atoll commander, and Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, USMC, Commander Ground Forces. After asking the colonel what major items of equipment he needed, the admiral said, "If I get you all these things, can you hold Midway against a major amphibious attack?" To which Shannon replied with a hearty, "Yes, sir," and he could have too. If the Japanese had broken through the Pacific Fleet and tried to land on Midway, they would have met an even hotter reception from the Marines than they gave the Marines at Tarawa. Sand and Eastern Islands were already ringed with coast defense, anti-boat and anti-aircraft guns, from 20mm up to the Old Navy 7 inches, when about the 20th of May, Nimitz let the atoll commander know what he had learned of the enemy's plans. All defense activities were then stepped up, and a furious reinforcement of the island began. On the 25th of May, United States ship St. Louis brought 2 rifle companies of Major Carlson's newly formed 2nd Raider Battalion, which later won fame at Guadalcanal, to augment the small infantry components of the Defense Battalion, and a 37mm anti-aircraft battery. Bomb-proof dugouts were constructed to accommodate all hands. On the 26th of May, United States ship Kitty Bork brought in 16 Marine Corps Douglas dive bombers, 7 Wildcat fighter planes, 22 pilots, more anti-aircraft guns, and 5 light tanks. A few Catalina seaplanes and amphibians were already stationed in the lagoon or on Eastern Island for air patrol. Their numbers were now increased to 30-odd. With the cooperation of the Hawaiian Army Command and the 7 Army Air Force, 18 B-17S and 4 B-26S were moved up to augment the 6 Navy Avengers. 10 motor torpedo boats were dispatched from the Hawaiian Sea Frontier Forces. By the 4th of June, there were 121 combat planes, 141 officers, and 2,886 enlisted men on the atoll. But the ground crews were not reinforced, and flying personnel had to do a good part of their own fueling and servicing. During the last 2 weeks before the battle, more coast defence and other guns were mounted for anti-boat and anti-aircraft work, barbed wire was strung, mines and underwater obstacles were emplaced, and guns were sighted for resisting a landing. "Wreck them on the reef," was Colonel Shannon's slogan, remembering Wake. A final load of drummed aviation gasoline arrived in the chartered freighter nearer Luckenbach on the afternoon of Sunday, the 31st of May. There was a dispute about overtime with the merchant marine crew, but the ship's officers and boatswains manned winches and tended hatches in order that the Marines could unload the cargo that night. A very careful and comprehensive search plan was drawn up by Captain Simard and placed in effect on the 30th of May. Weather greatly reduced the effectiveness of air search and exercised a considerable influence on the battle. In May and June, the waters to the west and northwest of Midway are often traversed by storms which move northeastward, preceded by weather fronts which produce clouds and rain. Even without a storm, fog can ordinarily be expected about 300 to 400 miles northwest of Midway, where the trade winds strike the Japan current. The Japanese knew as much about these conditions as we did, and took advantage of the expected fog and weather front to move their carriers as near as possible to Midway undetected. Their occupation force, on the other hand, approached through a normally fair weather area to the southwestward. During the last week of May, all forces destined for this great battle were on the move. Japanese submarines were the first to get under way. An advance reconnaissance unit comprising LL-121 and L-123, 1,400-ton mine-laying submarines, departed Japan in early May, each laden with about 40 tons of aviation gasoline and 12 tons of lubricating oil. After calling at Kwajalein, they made for French frigate Shoals in order to service Emily's, the big four-engined bombers. Arriving there on the 26th of May, they found already in the anchorage a seaplane tender which Admiral Nimitz had sent up in anticipation. After hanging about for 4 days and seeing no Japanese planes, I-121 and I-123 returned to Kwajalein. Another submarine of the same class reconnoitred Laysan and possibly Lisiansky Island. The main force of submarines was sent first to scout Oahu, then to move northwesterly. On the 3rd of June, it deployed along a NNE-SSW line between latitudes 26 degrees and 32 degrees N and longitudes 165 degrees and 170 degrees W. This was supposed to be in good time to intercept any Pacific Fleet task force that might move out, for, as we have seen, Yamamoto did not expect Nimitz to react until he heard of the attack on Midway Island. That was a bad guess. These submarines were behind Fletcher and Spruance all the way, and gave the Japanese no information whatsoever. The first surface group to get underway was Rear Admiral Kakuta's second mobile force, assigned to the Aleutians. Of those destined for Midway, with which we are immediately concerned, Nagumo's carrier striking force sorted from the inland sea of Japan on the evening of the 26th of May. Yamamoto, with the main body, followed them 2 days later. The transports of the Midway Occupation Force departed Saipan the evening of the 27th of May. Kurita's close support group of 4 powerful heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers left Guam at the same time and steamed 75 to 100 miles ahead of the transports. The seaplane carriers tagged along behind. Yamamoto was suffering from stomach trouble and seemed in unusually low spirits, but the main body as a whole was feeling very snug and secure behind the 18.1-inch guns of Yamato and the 16 inches of the other fast battleships. All hands were singing war songs at the top of their lungs, confident of annihilating the Pacific Fleet. Sailors whose duties did not involve much exercise were put through daily calisthenics, and there was much sunbathing topside until the main body entered the weather front on the afternoon of the 1st of June. Commander Striking Force was feeling none too easy despite his tactical superiority. His carriers had returned to home waters on the 23rd of April after their Indian Ocean raid, and so had had barely a month for upkeep and repair of ships, refresher training for anti-aircraft crews and flight training for aviators. That, to be sure, was 3 weeks more than Fletcher and Spruance had. "We participated in the operation," wrote Nagumo after the battle, "with meagre training and without knowledge of the enemy." Of course he knew where to find Midway, his first objective. Striking force orders were to execute an aerial attack on Midway, destroying all enemy air forces stationed there on the 4th of June, in preparation for the landing on the 5th. This looked like an easy assignment, and the High Command was so confident of success that it provided the occupation force with new Japanese names for the two islets and for Midway itself, the last meaning glorious month of June. So it was, but not for them. Midway was so crowded with marines, planes, supply and oil dumps and other installations that there was scarcely room for the goony birds, whose hoarse dissent from these goings-on could be heard above the humming of plane motors and the booming of the surf. Captain Simard and staff, Colonel Shannon and his staff had their hands full with defensive preparations, such as mining all likely approaches and landing beaches. Radio traffic, most of which had to be coded or decoded, air search operations, unloading ships, and housekeeping on an immense scale kept everyone busy. A demolition plan was tested shortly before the battle and somewhat too realistically. A sailor threw the wrong switch and 400,000 gallons of aviation gasoline went up in flames. The fire was kept under control, and over 500,000 gallons were left, but thereafter all planes, including B-17S, had to be refueled by hand from 55-gallon drums. The first consideration was air search. It was imperative that the enemy be discovered at the earliest possible moment in order to prevent him from sneaking within plane launching distance and pulling a Pearl Harbor on Midway. Beginning the 30th of May, 22 Catalinas searched daily the sector SSW to NNE 700 miles out, and another PBY took off during the graveyard watch in order to be at the expected launching position of the enemy carriers at dawn. As intelligence had reported that 2 enemy forces would rendezvous 700 miles west of Midway, there was added a daily search attack mission by Army flying fortresses to arrive at that point around 1500 each day. Nothing was sighted until the 3rd of June. About 300 miles to the northwestward of Midway, there was a weak front, rendered almost stationary by a large high-pressure area centered northeast of the island and affording perfect cover for Nagumo's carriers. More than once they could hear the motors of American search planes in the clouds above them, but most of the Midway-based aircraft were not yet equipped with radar and could pick up ships only visually. It was so thick around the Japanese striking force at noon the 2nd of June that Admiral Nagumo lost visual contact with his own ships. At 13:30, when his staff navigator figured that the designated point for a change of course toward Midway had been reached, the Admiral had to break radio silence to give the order. Rear Admiral Robert H. English, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, had charge of deploying the 25 submarines at his disposal. 12 boats were collected for a Midway patrol group by sending some out from Pearl between 21 and the 24th of May and pulling in others from the mandates and elsewhere. These were assigned patrol stations west of Midway. 3 more, the roving short stops of the disposition, patrolled a scouting line 200 miles north of the Hawaiian chain and halfway between Midway and Oahu, in case the enemy should attempt a diversionary attack on Pearl Harbor. 4 submarines were sent to patrol about 300 miles north of Oahu, and 6 more supported the Aleutians Force. Admiral Spruance's task force, built around Enterprise and Hornet, departed Pearl the 28th of May to hold Midway and inflict maximum damage on the enemy by strong attrition tactics. Admiral Fletcher's Yorktown force sortied at 9 on the 30th, with orders to conduct target practice and then support Task Force 16. Spruance on the last day of May and Fletcher on the 1st of June met Oilers Cimarron and Platte and had their last fueling until after the battle. Spruance then doubled back to meet Fletcher at the 16th of June, 2 at latitude 32 degrees N, longitude 17.3 degrees W, about 325 miles northeast of Midway. The carriers were now beyond the scope of land-based air searches and had to protect themselves. Hornet flew a search mission 150 miles out on the 1st of June, with no contacts. Enterprise searched the sector west to northwest on the morning of the 2nd, but all planes returned early on account of bad weather. The enemy carriers were still behind their protective weather front. That day, Admiral Spruance made the following visual signal to the ships of his task force. An attack for the purpose of capturing Midway is expected. The attacking force may be composed of all combatant types, including 4 or 5 carriers, transports, and train vessels. If presence of Task Forces 16 and 17 remains unknown to enemy, we should be able to make surprise flank attacks on enemy carriers from position northeast of Midway. Further operations will be based on result of these attacks, damage inflicted by Midway forces, and information of enemy movements. The successful conclusion of the operation now commencing will be of great value to our country. Should carriers become separated during attacks by enemy aircraft, they will endeavour to remain within visual touch. First air contacts on the enemy were made by Midway-based planes on the occupation force. Ensign Jack Reed was flying a Catalina almost 700 miles from Midway shortly before June 3rd. His sector covered the point at which intelligence expected 2 Japanese forces to rendezvous. The pilots used to draw straws to see who would fly it at dawn. Reed had run down to the end of his arc, on the westerly bearing from Midway. It was time to turn back, but he decided to go on for a few minutes. Suddenly he sighted 30 miles ahead what appeared to be the main enemy fleet, looking like miniature ships in a backyard pond. "Do you see what I do?" he asked his co-pilot. "You are damned right I do," was the reply. Popping in and out of clouds, they tracked the force for several hours, and by 11 were able to report 11 ships making 19 knots to the eastward. This was probably the combined transport and seaplane groups of the Midway Occupation Force, which was then indulging in a final battle drill, including the arming of flamethrowers. United States Marines will learn with envy that their opposite numbers of the Cure Special Naval Landing Force in one transport were supplied with 10 cases of beer after the drill, and got away with it all. Captain Simard at Midway reacted immediately to the contact report, sending out 9 B-17s. At 16:24 the same day, 570 miles out, they found the transports, made 3 high-level, 8,000 to 12,000 feet bombing attacks, and reported having hit 2 battleships or heavy cruisers and 2 transports. But actually these planes made no hits. Next, 4 amphibious Catalinas, each armed with 1 aerial torpedo, were sent to attack this formation. A radar contact at 1:15 June 4th led them to where the transports were set forth in bright moonlight. At 1:43 3 torpedoes were dropped, and 1 hit the oiler Akabono Maru. The explosion terminated or wounded 23 men and slowed the ship temporarily, but she regained formation. The battle was on. The whole course of the war in the Pacific may hinge on the developments of the next 2 or 3 days, recorded the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific analyst, on receipt of this news. It did. The action about to be joined was one of the most decisive of the war. At the 18th of June 3, after the first air attacks had been made by Midway-based planes on the Japanese transports, Yorktown, Enterprise and Hornet were a good 300 miles ENE of Midway, 400 miles east, and a little south, of the point where Nagumo's carriers were steaming at 25 knots toward their planned plane launching point. Admiral Fletcher had received the first reports of contact with the enemy in good season, and although they were reported to him as the main body of the Japanese fleet, he correctly estimated that our planes had seen only a transport group with escort. He trusted his original intelligence report to the effect that an enemy carrier force would be approaching Midway from the northwest to launch an air attack on the atoll at dawn June 4th. And that is exactly what Nagumo was doing. So Fletcher changed course to the southwestward, 210 degrees, at 1950 June 3rd, with the object of arriving by break of day at a position about 200 miles north of Midway, whence he could fly an attack against Nagumo's carriers, provided their position had been ascertained. He correctly assumed that his presence was still unknown to the enemy, and that he might avoid detection next morning until Nagumo's planes were already winging their way to Midway. Thus, during the night of 3, the 4th of June, the opposing carrier forces were approaching one another on courses which, if maintained, would have crossed a few miles northwest of the atoll. Thursday, the 4th of June, a day fatal to Japan's hopes of victory, began to break shortly after 4 o'clock. By sunrise, at 4:57, there was a gentle, force 3, trade wind blowing from the southeast, enough for launching planes against an enemy to the westward without much loss of distance. Everyone hoped it would breeze up, but by 8 the wind had fallen away to mere light airs, 4 to 5 knots, which forced the carriers to steam at 21 knots away from the enemy in order to launch or recover. Visibility, 35 to 40 miles, was much too good for the carrier's health. The air temperature throughout the day was pleasantly cool, 68 degrees to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. As it was Yorktown's turn to search, at 4:30 she launched 10 SBDs to cover the northern semicircle to a radius of 100 miles, a proper precaution against being jumped by the planes of unlocated carriers. At that moment, Nagumo was about 215 miles to the westward, sending off his first strike on Midway. He still had the brakes in the matter of weather. From Kaga's log, it is evident that the striking force was not yet out of the front. Yet, despite a low 50% cloud cover and visibility of only 15 miles, American searchplanes from Midway managed to spot their fast-approaching enemy. At 5:34 June 4th, the long-awaited word was received on board Enterprise: enemy carriers. This was an intercepted message from a searching PBY to its base at Midway. Next, at 5:45, came a plain English dispatch from the same source: many enemy planes heading Midway bearing 320 degrees distant 150. Then, at 6:03, 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees distant 180 miles from Midway, course 135 degrees, speed 25. That position was about 200 miles WSW of Task Force 16. These were the first indications received by any United States command afloat as to where the enemy carriers were. The position given was incorrect by about 40 miles, and only 2 of the 4 flat tops were sighted, but at least Fletcher and Spruance now knew the approximate whereabouts of the striking force. Admiral Fletcher wished to recover Yorktown's search mission and await further intelligence before launching a strike, and so passed the ball to Admiral Spruance. At 6:07, only 4 minutes after receiving the last contact report, he ordered Spruance with Enterprise and Hornet to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located, and promised to follow as soon as planes recovered. Thus, only 10 minutes before the air battle over Midway commenced, Fletcher sparked off the train of events that resulted in the loss of 4 Japanese carriers. Leaving the American carriers for the moment, let us follow the planes that took off from all 4 Japanese carriers at 4:30, when 240 miles distant from Midway. Lieutenant Tomonaga, flight officer of Hiryu, led this formidable attack group consisting of 36 Kate torpedo planes armed with 805-kilo bombs, and 36 Val dive bombers escorted by 36 Zeke fighter planes. At 5:53, when the Midway search radar picked up the vanguard of this flight, it was 93 miles northwest of the island. The air raid alarm was promptly sounded, and shortly after 6, every plane able to leave the ground was in the air. The bombers and Catalinas, which would be useless for interception or defense, were ordered to keep out of the way. Major Parks's Marine Corps fighter squadron was sent out against the approaching enemy. At 6:16, when 30 miles out and at 12,000 feet altitude, they encountered the first of the 108 Japanese planes, bombers in a rigid V of Vs and fighters overhead. The Marine Corps fighters climbed to 17,000 feet and swooped down to intercept, but were hopelessly outnumbered. Within a few minutes, there were 1 to 5 Zeeks on the tail of each Marine fighter, who were so busy trying to shake them off that they could give no more attention to the bombers. And they did shake off many, or led their attackers right into the anti-aircraft fire being delivered from Midway. Within a few minutes, the high-altitude bombers had hit Midway, releasing from a height of 14,000 feet. The first explosive fell around 6:30. Val dive bombers came in next through vicious anti-aircraft fire, as Nagumo described it. They destroyed the Marines' command post and mess hall, and badly damaged the powerhouse on Eastern Island, destroyed the oil tanks on Sand Island, destroyed the seaplane hangar, set the hospital and storehouses afire, and damaged the gasoline system. But their attempts to render the runways unusable were unsuccessful, and they terminated very few men on the ground. This one and only attack on Midway was over by 6:50. At 7:15, after enemy planes had departed for their carriers and the all-clear had sounded, Colonel Kimes broadcast, "Fighters land, refuel by divisions." Pitifully, few responded. It was providential indeed that any survived this air battle, for the 20 antique Buffaloes and 6-period Wildcats were outclassed in almost every respect by the Japanese Zeeks, the 0 Mark I fighter. 17 with their pilots, including Major Parks, were missing and 7 others severely damaged. The Japanese were vague about plane losses in their official reports, since they lost all by next day. But a careful count on the American side indicates that at least 1/3 of the attack group never returned, shot down by the Marine Fighter Squadron or by anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese had hit first and hard. They had won the first round, but they entered the ring weaker in the second. Almost at the very moment when the enemy hit Midway, the first of a series of counterattacks on Nagumo's striking force got underway. Admiral Nimitz had ordered Captain Simard to go all out for the carriers, leaving defense of the atoll to its own guns. The 6 new Avenger torpedo planes, TBFs, and the 4 Annie Marauders, B-26S, also armed with torpedoes, airborne before the air attack, flew off around 6:15 without fighter protection. They encountered the enemy carriers at 7:10, but the Japanese saw them first and had time to augment combat air patrol. 4 or 5 of the Midway-based planes were shot down before they could reach a launching position. Hiryu's flight officer testified after the war that their torpedoes didn't seem to have any speed at all. One that porpoised was hit and exploded by machine gun fire. 1 torpedo plane, hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashed Akagi's flight deck and bounced off into the sea. 2 or 3 more were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and out of 6 TBFs only 1 returned, badly shot up. No brilliant debut for the Avenger, which was to accomplish so much good laser in the war. One of the 2 B-26S that returned to Midway and crash-landed was repaired so that it could proceed next day to Pearl Harbor, where the pilot's story lost nothing in the telling, and an Air Force colonel went on the air with a tall tale of torpedoing a Japanese carrier. This was the first news that the American public had of the battle. The Army claimed 3 torpedo hits on the carriers, and the Navy admitted 1. Actually, there were none, not even a near miss. At this point came a bit of good luck for the United States. Admiral Nagumo, when sending his first strike against Midway at break of day, had reserved 93 planes armed with bombs and torpedoes to deal with enemy ships, in case any were discovered in the vicinity. But the search mission that he sent out, consisting of 7 cruiser float planes, was late in starting and almost perfunctory. The first 3 float planes, launched between 4:35 and 4:42, found nothing. The 4th, from cruiser tone, got off at 5, half an hour late, luckily for us. 2 hours passed, and no contact report reached the Admiral. At 7, he received a message from Lieutenant Tominaga, commanding the planes that had just finished striking Midway. There is need for a second attack wave. 10 minutes later came in the bomber attack from Midway, which proved that Tominaga was right. So, at 7:15, the Japanese admiral made a fatal decision. He broke the spot of the 93 planes prepared for instant launching against surface forces, ordered them struck below to clear his flight decks for the recovery of the Midway strike, and ordered the torpedo plane's armament to be changed to bombs for a second attack on the atoll, a job that required a good hour's hard work. Then, at 7:28, came a message from the belated tone plane that shifted the scenery. On his return flight, this pilot sighted what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships in position bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. For the first time, Nagumo knew he had to deal with enemy ships, but the report was so vague, with no hint of enemy carriers, that the Admiral did not see fit to cancel the scrambling of his attack group. Besides, he had to keep his flight decks clear to recover the Midway strike. Perhaps the reported enemy force did not amount to much anyway. 10 ships, he could take care of them at his leisure. Nagumo deliberated for 15 minutes, and at 7:45 changed his mind. He signalled his own force. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs. Perhaps he then recalled Hara's major error at Coral Sea, wasting a major air effort on an oiler. For 2 minutes later, the Admiral radioed the tone search plane, ascertain ship types and maintain contact. The pilot replied at 8:09, "Enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers," an estimate that he augmented at 8:20. "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A conservative fellow, that pilot." Thus, at 8:20, Nagumo learned for the first time that he would have to deal with at least one American carrier, but he was now even less capable of doing anything about it than he had been half an hour earlier. His planned attack group was already broken down. His flight decks must be kept clear for the planes expected momentarily from Midway. He had to be on the receiving, not the giving end of a carrier battle. What a break of luck. In the meantime, the Japanese carriers had been beating off more land-based air attacks, a process not conducive to tactical thinking by the staff. At 7:55:16, Marine Corps dive bombers, which had taken off from Midway an hour earlier, came in. Owing to the inexperience of the pilots, the flight commander, Major Lofton Henderson, decided to make a glide bombing attack. Zeeks jumped his planes and shot down several, including his own. Captain Elmer G., Iron Man, Glidden USMC, then took over the lead and dropped 9 or 10 bombs, all of which missed Hiryu, but one plane machine-gunned the carrier's deck and terminated 4 sailors. Only 8 of these SBDs returned, and 6 of them were damaged beyond repair. On one, 259 hits were actually counted, but the pilot, Lieutenant Daniel Iverson USMC, who even had the throat microphone shot off his neck, survived. 15 flying fortresses, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Walter C. Sweeney, United States of America, had cleared Midway before dawn to attack the occupation force, but were diverted to the carriers by Captain Simard and found them at 8:10. They dropped 8,500 pounds of explosives per plane from 20,000 feet altitude and returned safely, claiming 4 hits on 2 carriers. But none were better than near misses. Immediately after the B-17S pulled away, at 8:20, 11 Marine Corps Vindicators, which had taken off with the SBDs, came in on the carrier force. Zeeks, scenting easy meat, swarmed over these slow and almost defenseless bombers in such numbers that the flight leader, Major Benjamin W. Norris, USMC, shifted to the nearest target, battleship Haruna, already alleged to have been sunk by Colin Kelly off Luzon. 10 of them dove on her at 8:30 and dropped explosives. All missed, but 9 of the planes returned safely. Thus, these seaplane and land-based air attacks on the morning of the 4th of June resulted only in severe losses to the Midway-based groups and some dearly bought experience. An examination of Japanese records and the interrogations of Japanese officers by United States Army officers after the war will convince the most optimistic that no damage and only a few casualties were inflicted on enemy ships by land-based planes, whether Army, Navy or Marine Corps, on the 4th of June. In the midst of these flying fortress and Vindicator attacks, or just between the two, the enemy formation ran afoul of United States submarine Nautilus. She had intercepted the early search plane report of contact with the carriers and promptly hastened north, looking for trouble. At 8 she found it, in the shape of a depth charge attack, the first of 4 that day, but managed to come up for a look-see at 8:20. The picture presented on raising the periscope was one never experienced in peacetime practice, reported her skipper, Lieutenant Commander W. H. Brockman. Jr. ships were on all sides moving across the field at high speed and circling away to avoid the submarine's position. Ranges were above 1,000 yards. The cruiser had passed over and was now astern. The battleship was on our port bow and firing her whole starboard broadside battery at the periscope. Flag hoists were being made, searchlights were trained at the periscope. At 8:25, Nautilus fired 1 torpedo at the battleship at a range of 4,500 yards and missed, then submerged to 150 feet. She survived undamaged the intensive depth charge attack that followed. This first phase of the battle ended in the enemy's favour. In exchange for perhaps 40 planes, he had destroyed over half the aircraft based on Midway and inflicted severe damage on the installations. All his fighting ships were intact, and his Zeeks and anti-aircraft fire had mowed down almost every good bomber that Simard had sent out. At 8:35, when the Japanese planes began to return, Midway appeared to need but one more strike to soften it up for the landing forces. But there was never to be a second strike on Midway. Birds of death and destruction were already winging their way to the Japanese carriers from Enterprise and Hornet. Proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located. I will follow as soon as planes recovered. It was 6:07, about an hour and 10 minutes after sunrise. A gentle breeze, about 6 or 7 knots, was blowing from the SSE. The sea was calm and visibility good. All ships went to general quarters. Within a few minutes, the 2 carriers, 6 cruisers, and 9 destroyers of Task Force 16 had changed course to 240 degrees and bent on 25 knots. The aviators, who had breakfasted as early as 1:30 and twice manned their planes and twice been ordered back to the ready room, began warming up for a real strike. Spruance had originally intended to launch his planes at 9, when there would be less than 100 miles of ocean for them to cover, provided the Japanese carriers maintained course toward the atoll. But, as reports came in of the strike on Midway, he decided, on the advice of his chief of staff, to launch 2 hours earlier in the hope of catching the carriers in the act of refueling planes on deck for a second strike on the atoll. That was a tough decision for Spruance to make. He knew that the greater distance to cover hazarded a loss of many planes and pilots through running out of gas. His torpedo planes had a combat radius of only 175 miles. But the commensurate risk seemed worth accepting, and he made his choice at just the right moment. About 20 minutes before Nagumo decided, so fortunately for us and disastrously for him, to break down his attack group that had been readied for bombing ships and to rearm the planes for a second strike on Midway. Planes started taking off from Enterprise and Hornet at 7:02. Within half an hour, before launching was half complete, Admiral Spruance knew that his force had been snooped by an enemy float plane. That was the one from Cruiser Tone, whose belated and inaccurate contact report gave Nagumo his first hint of what to expect. Spruance feared that he had lost that precious tactical asset, surprise, but there was no question of cancelling the strike. Moreover, Captain Browning estimated that the Japanese planes which had attacked Midway Island could not return to their carriers before 0900. Hence Nagumo, even if he knew where the American carriers were, must maintain course toward Midway for some time in order to recover. And so he did, although recovery was completed earlier than Browning had calculated. A second important decision by Spruance was to make an all-out attack, to launch a full load, every operational plane except those needed for patrol around the task force. That again proved to be the correct decision, although it required over an hour to complete the launching, since about half the planes had to be brought up from the hangar deck, and in the meantime the planes first launched were eating up gas. The strike comprised 20 Wildcat fighters, 67 Dauntless dive bombers and 29 Devastator torpedo bombers, 23 fairly evenly divided between Enterprise and Hornet air groups, in addition to 18 Wildcats which swooped around Task Force 16 as combat air patrol, and the same number to relieve them. After launching, the ships resumed base course 240 degrees with 25 knot speed. Fletcher promptly adopted the same course and speed as Spruance. He delayed launching, however, for over 2 hours, thinking that there might be other Japanese carriers than those already reported, against which he more could profitably direct his attack. At 8:38, having received no additional contact reports, he decided to launch half his dive bombers and all his torpedo planes with fighter escort. By 9:06, Yorktown's strike group of 17 SBDs, 12 TBDs and 6 F-4 F-3S was in the air. Another deck load was readied to take off if needed. The Admiral's caution in saving planes for an emergency was natural and proper. It was less than a month since he had been misled by poor contact reports into going all out for Little Shoho at the Battle of the Coral Sea. This 4th of June was a cool and beautiful day, perfect for carrier war if the wind had only been stronger and from the enemy's direction. At 19,000 feet, pilots could see all around a circle of 50 miles radius. Only a few fluffy cumulus clouds were between them, and an ocean that looked like a dish of wrinkled blue Persian porcelain. Small consolation, to be sure, for these young men who were to fall that day in flames, or drown in the broad ocean whose mastery they were to win for their country. Yet if a sailor must sacrifice his life, the airway is the fairest. The tense, crisp briefing in the ready room, the warming up of planes which the devoted ground crews have been checking, arming, fueling and servicing, the ritual of the takeoff, as precise and ordered as a ballet plane's, swooping in graceful curves over the ships while the group assembles, hand signalling and waving to your wingman, whom you may never see again, a long flight over the superb ocean, First sight of your target and the sudden catch at the heart when you know that they see you, from the black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts that suddenly appear in the clear air, the wriggling and squirming of the ships, followed by wakes like the tails of white horses, the dreaded zeeks of combat air patrol swooping down on you apparently out of nothing, and finally the tight, incredibly swift attack, when you forget everything but the target so rapidly enlarging and the desperate necessity of choosing the exact moment, the right tenth of a second, to release and pull out. While these bright ministers of death were on their way, Nagumo's striking force continued for over an hour, as Spruance had hoped, to steam toward Midway. The 4 carriers were grouped in a box-like formation in the center of a protecting screen of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. A Cargi, flagship here as in the Pearl Harbor strike, had the flank position to starboard. 2,000 meters astern steamed her sister ship Kaga. 5,000 meters to port steamed the other carrier division, Hiryu and Soryu. They had come through these repeated strikes by land-based bombers without suffering a single hit, and after shooting down half the planes that attacked them, had straightened out again on the southeasterly course. Their crews were feeling very proud and confident, but Admiral Nagumo, fearing the worst, was nervous and apprehensive. At 8:37, the 4 Japanese carriers commenced recovering planes returning from Midway. The belated attack of a tail-end Charlie among the Marine Corps Vindicators did not bother them. The air was now full of messages from reconnaissance planes about the approach of American carrier-based aircraft. At 9:05, before the last of his planes were recovered, Admiral Nagumo could wait no longer. He ordered striking force to turn to the ENE, a 90-degree change of course. "We plan to contact and destroy the enemy task force," he signaled to the vessels under his command. Plane recovery completed. The formation executed the change of course at 9:17. The Japanese carriers were in exactly the condition Spruance wanted to find them, all bomber planes on board, rearming and refueling going on feverishly. Now came a break for Nagumo. By his change of course to 70 degrees, he evaded the dive bombers of 1 American carrier. Commander Stanhope C. Ring, Hornet's attack group commander, leading 35 SBDs with fighter cover, missed the enemy at his anticipated position on the southeasterly course, followed that bearing toward Midway, and so drew a blank. 13 of his bombers had to land at Midway for refueling, 2 splashed in the lagoon, all his Wildcats had to ditch for lack of gas, and the entire group missed the battle. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, leading Hornet's torpedo squadron, knew that he had small chance to survive. In his last message to the squadron, appended to his attack plan the evening before, he had written, "I feel we are all ready. I actually believe that under these conditions we are the best in the world. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only 1 plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all." Just before launching, he reported to Captain Mark Mitcher for final instructions and promised he would press through against all obstacles, well knowing his squadron was doomed to destruction with no chance whatever of returning safely to the carrier. Waldron's low-flying TBDs became separated en route from Ring's high-flying planes, owing to intervening cloud layers, but Waldron turned northward when he missed the Japanese carriers where they were supposed to be. At about 9:25, he sighted 2 columns of smoke rising over the horizon and changed course for them. That was the enemy. Within a few minutes, the Japanese combat air patrol found Waldron, naked of fighter plane protection. Anti-aircraft fire, too, began to reach the TBDs when they still had 8 miles to go. Waldron wiggled his wings as a signal to follow, opened up the throttle and pressed home an attack at low altitude. Beset on all sides by the deadly Zero fighters, which were doggedly attacking them in force, and faced with a seemingly impenetrable screen of cruisers and destroyers, the squadron drove in valiantly at short range. Plane after plane was shot down by fighters, anti-aircraft bursts were searing faces and tearing out chunks of fuselage, and still the squadron bored in. Those who were left dropped their torpedoes at short range. Then they too were shot down, everyone, and for a plane to splash when flying at high speed close to the water was like hitting a stone wall. Out of 30 pilots and crewmen in the 15 planes, Ensign George H. Gay alone survived. He launched his torpedo and pulled out 10 feet above the carrier's deck. Then his left rudder pedal was knocked out by an explosive bullet and the plane splashed. His radio man was already deceased. Gay, only slightly wounded, managed to reach the surface as the plane sank and hid under a rubber seat cushion to escape the notice of strafing Zeeks. From that low and precarious vantage point, he observed the next attack, inflated his life raft at dusk, climbed aboard and was rescued by a Catalina the following afternoon. The Enterprise Torpedo Squadron, Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay, which departed on its mission at 8:06 simultaneously with Hornets, never had fighter protection because its Wildcat escort, Lieutenant Gray's Squadron 6, inadvertently accompanied Waldron instead. By changing course in time, Lindsay sighted the carriers shortly after 9:30. Because of the short combat radius of his planes, he decided to attack immediately without waiting for the dive bombers. Clever maneuvering by the Japanese forced the TBDs to circle widely in order to make a beam attack on carrier Kaga, over which the Zeeks were as thick as flies around a garbage can. Down they flew to attack the lumbering devastators. 10 of the 14, including Lindsay's, were shot down, and the few that launched torpedoes never made a hit. This attack had barely been snuffed out when, at 1,000, Yorktown's torpedo squadron, Lieutenant Commander Lance E. Massey, came in. Thatch's 6 escorting Wildcats were soon overpowered by a cloud of Zeeks. Massey, like Waldron and Lindsay, bore in courageously against carrier Soryu, and another debacle ensued. 7 devastators, including Massey's, fell in flames. Only 5 were able to launch torpedoes, and 3 of these were shot down. Again, no hits. Thus, out of 41 torpedo planes from the 3 carriers, only 6 returned, and not a single torpedo reached the enemy ships. Yet it was the stark courage and relentless drive of these young pilots of the obsolete torpedo planes that made possible the victory that followed. The radical maneuvering that they imposed on the Japanese carriers prevented them from launching more planes, and the TBDs, by acting as magnets for the enemy's combat air patrol and pulling Zeeks down to near water level, enabled the dive-bombing squadrons that followed a few minutes later to attack virtually unopposed by fighter planes and to drop bombs on full deck loads in the process of being refueled. The Japanese were given no time to glory in their victory over the devastators, for the dauntless dive-bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown appeared immediately after. Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey of Enterprise had launched early, and at 7:45 had been ordered by Admiral Spruance to proceed on mission assigned without the torpedo bombers, which were the last to be launched and for which, as the more vulnerable, the Wildcat escort was reserved. So McCluskey got going at 7:52 with no fighter plane protection. An hour and a half later, when he reached the point of anticipated contact with the Japanese carriers, only empty ocean met the group commander's eye. He decided to search beyond the safe limit of fuel endurance and continued for 35 miles in the same direction, thinking the enemy might have changed course to the southwestward. At 9:35 he turned northward, and at 9:55, from 19,000 feet altitude, sighted a Japanese destroyer hightailing to the northeastward and throwing spray. This was Arashi, which had dropped behind to deliver a depth-charge attack on Nautilus. Correctly assuming that she was trying to catch up with Nagumo's striking force, McCluskey took his course from her. Lieutenant Gray's fighter squadron from Enterprise made the mistake of attaching itself to Waldron's Hornet torpedo squadron and never knew it. Gray sighted the Japanese carriers as early as 9:10, and almost at the same moment saw Waldron's VT-8, flying about 19,000 feet below him, fly into a low-hanging cloud in the direction of the enemy. He assumed they were about to attack and awaited the signal prearranged with Lindsay, which of course never came, to come down and cover them. So Gray's Wildcats passed the time of the disastrous torpedo plane attack uselessly orbiting at high altitude, where there were no Zeeks to fight. At 9:52, Gray broke radio silence to inform McCluskey that he was running short of gas and would have to return soon, and at 1,000, somewhat belatedly it would seem, he reported the presence and course of half the striking force. That was the first word to reach Fletcher or Spruance that any of their planes had found the enemy. A few minutes later, McCluskey heard the unmistakable voice of Miles Browning over the radio telephone shouting, "Attack! Attack!" To which the group commander replied, "Wilco, as soon as I find the enemy," or words to that effect. Within a few moments he found them. He could see all 4 carriers rapidly manoeuvring to escape the torpedo plane attacks, not yet over. The diameter of their circular disposition was roughly 8 miles. Akagi was the westernmost carrier, with Soryu on her starboard beam. Kaga steamed astern on Akagi's starboard quarter, and Hiryu was well ahead, a position which afforded her a few hours' grace. McCluskey had under his command 2 squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers, 37 planes including his own. He ordered Gallagher's squadron to follow him in attacking Kaga, and Best's to take care of Akagi. Gallagher carried 500-pound bombs because his SBDs had been launched from the carrier so early that less than half the flight deck had been available, not enough takeoff for a heavily armed plane. But Best's, which had taken off later, carried 1,000-pound bombs. By great good luck, Best's second division of 3 planes attacked Kaga by mistake, so that each carrier got its share of the half-ton bombs. Both squadrons made 70-degree dives at about 280 knots, encountering no interference from fighter planes and very little from anti-aircraft fire. For the Japanese combat air patrol had come down low to get the torpedo planes a few minutes earlier, and there was no time to climb back. This dive-bombing attack knocked out 2 carriers. Akagi had 40 planes on her flight deck being fueled and serviced. At 10:26, only 2 minutes after she had evaded the last of the torpedo bombers, she received 3 bomb hits. "We were unable to avoid the dive, bombers because we were so occupied in avoiding the torpedo attacks," said Captain Aoki. Her log thus describes the attack. 3 bombers dive on Akagi from positions bearing 80 degrees to port. At about 500 meters altitude, explosives were loosed. First was a near miss about 10 meters abeam of bridge. Second hit near the elevator amidships, fatal hit. Third hit the flight deck on the port side, aft. These were enough. The third hit exploded in the midst of airplanes on the flight deck that were just changing their armament from bombs for Midway to torpedoes for Fletcher and Spruance. The second explosive exploded in the hangar, detonating the stored torpedoes. "There was a terrific fire aboard ship which was just like hell," said Nagumo's chief of staff, an unusually outspoken Japanese. Admiral Nagumo thought the situation was under control and refused to come down from the bridge. But the captain of the ship advised him that the ship was out of control and that it should be abandoned, and wanted him to abandon ship, but he refused. Admiral Nagumo was an extremely hot-tempered person and consequently insisted on remaining on the bridge. I myself, as chief of staff, tried to convince him that it was his duty as commander-in-chief to abandon ship and transfer to some other ship where he could control the actions of the fleet, because it was no longer possible to communicate with other ships by wireless from Akagi, and the signal flags and semaphore weren't sufficient to direct the battle. Although Admiral Nagumo refused to come down, I finally had the others drag him by the hand and talk him into leaving the ship, but couldn't find a way down. Everything was so covered with smoke and flame. There was no way of getting down from the bridge, except by a rope which we hung from the bridge. When I got down, the deck was on fire, and anti-aircraft and machine guns were firing automatically, having been set off by the fire aboard ship. Cadavers were all over the place, and it wasn't possible to tell what would be shot up next, had my hands and feet burned a pretty serious burn on one foot. That is eventually the way we abandoned the Akagi helter-skelter, no order of any kind. According to the log, it was at 10:47 that Nagumo and staff left in this manner, which must have been a sore trial to Japanese dignity. They were taken off by a destroyer and transferred to light cruiser Nagara of the screen, where Nagumo flew his flag during the remainder of the battle. En route to the cruiser, the admiral could see fires raging on Soryu and Kaga, but he decided to continue the battle with the yet undamaged Hiryu. The ritual of transferring the emperor's portrait from Akagi to a destroyer was completed at 17:15. Damage control laboured 2 hours longer, very inefficiently according to the chief of staff, trying to control fires and rig enough power to work her into port. But at 19:15 the engineer officer reported that there was no hope, and Captain Aoki ordered all hands to abandon ship. She drifted northward, and before sunrise, the 5th of June, was sunk by a torpedo from a Japanese destroyer. Kaga means increased joy, but whatever luck the name had brought to that ship ran out fast when McCluskey, Gallagher, and Best began working her over. 4 hits they scored. One explosive, landing just forward of the island, blew it to bits and eliminated everyone on the bridge, including the captain. The other 3 set fire to planes that were being refueled, penetrated the hangar, and induced explosions in the gasoline or bomb stowage room below. In a few moments, Kaga was a mass of flames, and the Emperor's portrait was hurriedly transferred to a destroyer. A considerable number of officers and men abandoned ship forthwith, but others remained on board to fight the fires. Commander Amagai, flight officer of Kaga, swimming near the burning carrier, saw a periscope rise above the surface. The submarine, which has never been identified, fired a torpedo at Kaga, which hit. "But," said Amagai, "it was such a glancing blow fired at such an angle that the torpedo bounced off the side of the ship and circled slightly, after which the warhead dropped off and sank, although the body of the torpedo remained floating near me. Several of our sailors clung to the floating after part of the torpedo, a use of American torpedoes not anticipated by the Bureau of Ordnance." Amagai from his fish-eye view observed the carrier burning fiercely from stem to stern, and the anti-aircraft batteries were firing from induced explosion of their magazines. Even the paint on her topsides was aflame. After floating about for 3 hours, this officer was picked up by a destroyer from whose deck he saw one tremendous explosion in Kaga, and shortly after, at 19:25, she sank hissing into a 2,600 fathom deep. 1 or 2 minutes before Akagi and Kaga received their lethal explosives hits from McCluskey's SBDs, Leslie's squadron of 17 SBDs from Yorktown struck Soryu. The attack group to which these planes belonged had begun its flight at 9:06, more than an hour and a quarter after that of Enterprise and Hornet. But the Yorktown Air Group commander was a little smarter than his opposite numbers in figuring out the shortest way to the enemy carriers. Yorktown's planes were directed to fly straight to the line that connected the last reported position of the enemy force with Midway, and if nothing was sighted there, to fly up the reverse bearing, away from Midway. Leslie, on approaching that line at an altitude of 20,000 feet, saw smoke over the horizon which he rightly guessed came from Japanese ships making high speed. He promptly turned north and so caught up with McCluskey. He also caught up with Yorktown's torpedo planes, which had started 12 minutes earlier. The operation plan called for the dive bombers to attack first, but Massey went in impetuously with his devastators, and, as we have seen, was eliminated. Not so Leslie, who by a fortunate coincidence had arrived over the target at the same moment as McCluskey, and selected Soryu for attack while McCluskey was concentrating on Akagi and Kaga. Leslie commenced his attack from 14,500 feet. Soryu had just armed and fueled an attack group for a second sortie. Planes were lined up on the flight deck ready to take off. Others in the hangar were being refueled and rearmed, and she was turning south, dove down sun along her fore and aft axis at intervals of 30 seconds to 1 minute in 3 waves. The first approached the carrier from the starboard bow, the second from the starboard quarter, and the third from the port quarter. Although release altitudes averaged 2,500 feet, 3 lethal hits with 1,000-pound bombs were scored between 10:25 and 10:28. The first penetrated the flight deck forward of the superstructure, exploded in the hangar below, and folded the forward elevator back against the bridge. The second struck amidships in the midst of spotted planes, turning the after part of the flight deck into a sheet of flame and blowing a zeek over the side just as it was being launched. The third hit near the after elevator. The entire ship burst into flames, and within 20 minutes the crew were ordered to abandon by Captain Yanagimoto, whom they last saw bellowing slogans on the bridge. And not one of Leslie's planes was shot down. United States submarine Nautilus now lent a hand. Commander Brockman, since his unsuccessful attack on the cruiser screen at 8:25, had been making best surface speed to get back into the fight. At 11:45 he sighted on the horizon, 8 miles distant, smoke which he suspected came from a burning carrier. An hour later, after making a periscope depth approach, he identified the flat top as of Soryu class. Escorted by 2 destroyers, she was making about 2 knots on an even keel, and although the after part of her flight deck was demolished, all fires appeared to be under control. The executive officer of Soryu had sent a damage control party back on board, and as Nautilus closed, they could be seen trying to pass a tow line to small boats under the carrier's bow. Brockman took his time to reach a good firing position undetected, and between 13:59 and 14:05 fired 3 torpedoes from a distance of 2,700 yards. All 3 hit and exploded. Captain Komura of cruiser Chikuma saw them. A prolonged depth charge attack now began on Nautilus, and a long death agony for Soryu. When the submarine came up for another look at 16:10, the carrier was burning along her entire length, recalling to the submariner's great satisfaction the spectacle of Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Finally, the gasoline stowage aft exploded, whipsawing the ship. The afterpart sank first, and then the forward half blew up and sank around 1920. The American dive bombers had eventful flights back to their carriers. As McCluskey pulled away from the burning Akagi, his plane was pursued by 2 Zeeks for about 35 miles. He kept his SBD skimming the water, only 20 feet above the surface, which baffled the Zeeks. They used 7.7mm tracers to get his range, and then opened up with their 20mm, but fortunately had only a small supply of this caliber. At that, they put 55 small and 3 big holes in the plane, one of them through number 9 cylinder, which continued nevertheless to function besides peppering the pilot's left shoulder with fragments. As McCluskey wove the plane this way and that, his radio mechanic W.G. Choshalusek did wonders with a .30 caliber Browning. He shot down one Zeke and discouraged the other so that it pulled away. On another SBD, a twin-mounted machine gun broke loose during the dive. Although these guns are so heavy that it normally takes 2 men to lift them into the cockpit, gunner Floyd D. Adkins managed to prevent his from being snatched away by the powerful slipstream, and on the pull-out laid it on the plane's fuselage and shot down an attacking Zeke. Admiral Spruance's staff had miscalculated point option. That is a moving point whose initial position is set in advance of a carrier plane mission. It moves theoretically with the carriers. Pilots are informed of the course and speed the carrier expects to make good, and that becomes the course and speed of point option. The plane's navigator or pilot draws the line on his chart with 15 to 30-minute intervals pricked off, calculates before starting homeward at what place on the line point option will be, and sets his course accordingly. In this instance, the officer in tactical command had set point option's course as 240 degree and speed at 24 knots. The carriers were unable to make good more than 12 knots on that course, as they frequently had to head at 27 knots into the light and diminishing easterly airs to launch and recover combat or anti-submarine air patrol, and every such operation lost ground. And nobody let the planes know that Enterprise and Hornet were behind schedule. Consequently, when McCluskey's squadron reached the place where point option should have been, no ships were in sight. Enterprise was a good 60 miles to the northeastward. After making a circular search, McCluskey spotted a carrier and was just about to land when he saw it was Yorktown. Just then he sighted Enterprise beyond. With only 2 gallons of gasoline left, he continued to her and landed wobbly but safe. Others were not so lucky as their group leader. Several splashed for want of gas. Commander Leslie, having avenged on Soryu the loss of Yorktown's torpedo bombers, withdrew close to the water through heavy anti-aircraft fire from cruisers and destroyers. Fortunately, he had figured out that point option would move at a speed nearer 12 than 24 knots, so every one of his 17 SBDs found their carrier promptly. They were held in the air circling Yorktown, waiting for Lieutenant Commander Thach's fighter planes to turn up, because the Wildcats were certain to be low on gas and might be wanted again in a hurry. After losing one of his Wildcats and seeing 2 more chased out of the area by Zeeks, he and the 2 others climbed to 3,000 feet, where, by employing the famous Thach weave that he had invented, they managed to beat off 15 or 20 more Zeeks. Every so often a TBD would come limping out of the melee when Thach and his wingmen would escort her clear and return for more. He and 4 others of his squadron returned to their carrier safely, although 2 planes were badly shot up, and he brought Admiral Fletcher the first visual evidence that 3 Japanese carriers were burning and exploding. While Thach was making his oral report, word came from the radar room that Yorktown was about to be attacked, and Leslie's SBDs, whose turn had come to land, were ordered to clear out. After the attack was over, all but two, which ditched for want of gas, landed on the deck of Enterprise.